Welcome back to the deep dive. You know that iconic cone of uncertainty we see every hurricane season? Well, get this. It just got a makeover.
A visual refresh, you might say.
Exactly. And we're diving deep into the why. We've got a fascinating blog post straight from the National Hurricane Center, the folks who create the cone. Today, we'll unpack the changes and why they matter for you.
What's interesting here is how this graphic, something so ingrained in hurricane season, is constantly evolving. It's a testament to the importance of clear communication when lives are at stake.
So for those who need a little refresher, what exactly is the cone of uncertainty? I mean, is it like a line in the sand telling us exactly where a hurricane is going to go?
It's definitely not that precise. A better way to think about it might be like shining a flashlight on a wall. The further you step back, the more that spot of light spreads.
Right.
The cone works similarly. It's showing us the range of possible paths the center of the hurricane could take. Further out in time means a wider cone because the uncertainty grows.
So it's about probabilities, not exact predictions.
Exactly.
But this cone's been around forever, hasn't it? Why change it now?
And that's where this deep dive gets really interesting. The National Hurricane Center has introduced 3 key changes this year, and they're calling them experimental. They're essentially saying, hey, we're trying something new. Tell us what you think.
They're open to feedback, which is great. So what are these big changes?
One that jumped out at me was how they're handling watches and warnings, especially inland.
Yeah, it used to be that you'd only see those along the coast, right? You'd never see them inland.
Exactly. And that could give people further inland a false sense of security. Now we're seeing watches and warnings right there in the cone itself, specifically for the U.S.
That makes sense.
It's about making sure everyone understands the risk, no matter how far they are from the coast.
Didn't they give an example of why this is so important? A real-world example from this year?
They did. Remember Tropical Storm Alberto? It caused significant flooding inland. Looking back, there was a real difference in how those warnings were displayed in the U.S. versus Mexico, with the U.S. previously focusing more on the coast. This new approach aims to make that messaging much more consistent.
So even subtle visual cues can have a huge impact on how people interpret risk. And it's not just about where those warnings show up, right?
Yeah.
The blog post also mentioned some changes to how the cone itself looks alongside them.
It's true. They've definitely shifted the visual emphasis. The watches and warnings really pop now, even if it seems a bit odd at first glance.
It's like they're saying, hey, don't get fixated on the center of the storm. This is what you really need to pay attention to.
Exactly. The cone is still giving you that potential track, but for making decisions. Those watches and warnings are key. They tell you your risk level, which might be different from what the cone alone suggests.
Didn't they use Hurricane Beryl as an example of that?
Perfect example. Beryl's cone made it seem like parts of Texas might be in the clear, but there were still tropical storm warnings in effect.
Proving you can't just rely on the cone in isolation.
Exactly. You've got to connect those visual cues with the actual risk. And you know, something else that struck me while reading was their attention to detail, even tweaking the cone's shading.
Seems like a small change.
It is, but they explained it in the blog post, reducing visual clutter, making it easier to interpret. Every little bit helps when you're talking about something as complex as a hurricane forecast.
For sure. But those are the more visual changes. The blog post also got into some of the cone's limitations, things that even weather nerds like me find interesting.
Oh, absolutely. Like, for example, the whole concept of a hurricane transitioning into a post-tropical cyclone.
That always seems to trip people up.
Right. The cone itself might suggest the storm's weakening or moving away, but that's not always the whole story.
Makes me think of Hurricane Ida a couple years back. It was still wreaking havoc, even after it wasn't technically a hurricane anymore.
Exactly. And that's why understanding these nuances is so important. A post-tropical cyclone can still bring dangerous winds, flooding, tornadoes, even if the cone itself seems less threatening.
So it's like, don't let your guard down just because the cone looks like it's moving on.
Exactly. Don't rely on just one source of information. Check the forecast discussions, look for other warnings, and if you're ever unsure, reach out to local emergency management folks. They're there to help make sense of it all.
So it's not enough to just look at the cone. We need to be aware of all the other factors at play.
Absolutely. And you know what really resonated with me from that blog post? The analogy they used about trusting a doctor's advice.
Oh yeah, I loved that part.
It's about finding that balance, right? Acknowledging that there's uncertainty, but still providing reliable guidance.
They were saying, imagine if your doctor changed their diagnosis every 5 minutes, even if new info came up.
You'd be a wreck.
Totally. You need that consistent advice to make good decisions, especially when it comes to your health.
Exactly. And that's how the NHC is approaching these hurricane forecasts, aiming for consistency with watches and warnings.
So even if the cone itself is being adjusted as they get new data,
Those warnings should provide a more stable source of truth, you could say.
it's about building that trust, making sure people have a clear understanding of the risk, even as the situation changes.
Exactly. You don't want folks second-guessing themselves in the middle of a hurricane. So with this new experimental cone, it's clear the NHC wants to make those forecasts as useful as possible.
And what I find really encouraging is their openness to feedback. They're practically begging people to check out this new cone and tell them what they think.
They are, like they're saying, we're all in this together. Let's make this tool the best it can be.
It really highlights that we all have a role to play in hurricane preparedness.
Absolutely. Understanding these forecasts and how they're changing, that's a huge part of it.
Well said. So to our listeners, check out that experimental cone for yourselves. We'll have a link in the show notes. And while you're there, why not share your thoughts with the National Hurricane Center? Your feedback could shape the future of hurricane forecasting.
You know, this whole conversation has really got me thinking. It's not just about what the cone shows us, it's about what it doesn't show.
That's a good point.
By recognizing its limitations, we can be more informed. We can ask the right questions and ultimately make better decisions when a hurricane threatens our area.
It's about being empowered by the information, not intimidated by it. And on that note, thanks for diving deep with us today. Stay safe out there, and we'll catch you next time.